Hello crafty friends and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a card with a beautiful watercolor background that I created using my dye inks. We will also be fixing some card making mistakes, which is something really common. It's sometimes easy to fix some of these mistakes instead of redoing the entire thing all over again. Well, before we get started, I would really appreciate if you could take a minute to subscribe to my channel and hit on the bell icon so that you get notified every time I post a new video. Let us first take a look at the stamp set that I'll be using for our card today. This is the Lined Heart stamp set by Simon Says Stamp. Now, this was part of the To Be Loved release. This set features the big love you sentiment and the heart shape created by various lengths of parallel lines. You will also see that there are some small greetings which you could use as sub sentiments for your cards. And these are exactly what we will be using today to cover up our mistakes, which you will see later in the video. Now, since I planned on creating a watercolor background, I will be using the Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I decided to stamp and heat emboss my focal point and sentiment first. And well, we will be doing an embossed resist technique using some fun colors here. I placed my lined heart focal point towards the lower left corner of the panel, and on the top of the focal point I wanted the love you sentiment, which was more towards the upper right hand corner. To make sure that all of this lined up properly, I like to use my Simon Says Stamp grid transparency sheet, which is something that I use for almost every time when I'm stamping a sentiment. Now, since I plan on heat embossing, I first rub my panel using the anti-static powder tool and then using my Simon Says Stamp clear embossing ink, I stamped the focal point and the sentiment. I used Wow white embossing powder for this. Well, now embossing white on white, especially when you're using watercolor paper, is really difficult. Now, this watercolor paper is a lot more textured than your standard cardstock, and it's really important that you ink up your stamp really well. Probably this is what I missed here. It was not until I poured that embossing powder on this stamped image that I realized that I missed a small spot in the center of the heart. Well, I was not very confident on restamping this all over again since I was not sure if I would be properly able to align it, and I didn't want to ruin it even more. So I used my heat gun to melt the embossing powder, and you will see a tiny little portion of those lines in the heart are missing. Well, that is what we are going to cover up using the little sentiments from the stamp set. Now, to create my beautiful watercolor background, I use some beautiful pinks and purples and shades of dark blue from the Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated Ink Collection. Now, here I have Peony, Taffy, Amethyst, and Galaxy. Now, these are dye inks which are not just perfect for stamping and ink blending, but since these are water reactive, we will be doing some watercolor using them. Now, instead of using brush and watercolor palette that I would normally use, I wanted a very splotchy look. So I dabbed some of that ink onto a plastic sheet here. Now, this plastic sheet is probably some packaging from one of the stamp sets. Now, I dabbed the ink pad onto this plastic sheet and sprayed some water just to make the color moving. Now, I will do some ink smushing here. All I do is just tap the plastic sheet onto our panel. I'm not looking for any kind of perfection here. All I want is that every part of this panel needs to be covered with that ink. You will see that all of that embossed image will resist the watercolor, and the color gets only spread on the parts of the paper where there is no embossing or stamping. Now I repeated the same thing with all of the other colors of ink. At this point, I did not wait for the previous ink to dry completely. I was okay having the colors mix and blend a little. Now, I like this technique of ink smushing since it gives me a lot more imperfections and layering, which is exactly what I like when I do some technique like this. I feel that if I use a paintbrush, it would give me sharp lines, which is something that I don't prefer. Now, the Simon Says Stamp positively saturated inks appear to be a lot darker, but as they dry and settle into the paper, they do tone down a bit. Now, you could leave it as is, but I wanted this card to be a little more vibrant. So once my panel was completely dry, I used my ink blending brush, and using the same pinks and purples, I added some extra color all over the panel. You could definitely skip this step of ink blending, but I feel this brings out the color and makes the card look a lot more vibrant. In a way, I feel it enhances the imperfections of the ink smushing technique. Now, once we have inked up the panel, the missing embossed lines on our focal point is a lot more visible. Now, this is something that we will be covering using our sentiment strips. Well, next what I did is I took my splatter box and added some metallic gold splatters on the card front. I really love the gold on this background, so I decided not just the splatters but also adding a little gold to my edges too. For that, I will take some of that gold metallic watercolor onto a paintbrush and just drag it over the edges of the card panel. Now, if you want, you could also use your clear embossing ink pads and drag it over the edges and then heat set it with some beautiful gold embossing powder. Another way to do this would be using your gold metallic ink colors and drag the ink pad over the edges. There are so many ways you could add color to the edges of your card panel. I feel using watercolor on a paintbrush is the easiest way to do this, especially when you're using watercolor cardstock. Now, once I was done with all of the splatters and watercoloring the edges, I will let this panel completely dry while we go and work on our little sentiment strips that we will be using to cover up those little imperfections. I took three little sub-sentiments from the lined heart stamp set. We have "Life is better with you," "You are my happily ever after," and "You make my heart smile." I thought these would match perfectly on our card front. Now I stamped these sentiments onto a piece of black cardstock using the Wow white embossing powder, which matched perfectly with the white embossing on our background. I like to use a flathead brush to buff off any of that extra embossing powder around my stamped image. Also, if you notice that whenever I use my heat gun on such tiny little detailed image, I like to keep moving my heat gun around so that the embossing powder doesn't melt a lot and smudge the image. I used the featured sentiment die set by Altenew to cut out these tiny little sentiment strips. Now that our panel is completely dry, it was time to figure out how we could hide all of that imperfection. Now I decided to strategically place these little sentiment strips over the lined heart focal point, making sure that I will be able to cover most of those imperfections here. Initially, I thought I would use just two out of those three sentiments, but later I decided to use all three of them. Once I was satisfied with all of the position of my sentiment strip, it was now time to assemble our card front. Using some foam tape, I first adhered our watercolor background on top of a top folding A2 size card base. I also popped up my sentiment strips using some foam tape and adhered it over the lined heart focal point, covering all of that gaps. I used my T-square ruler to make sure that these strips are perfectly aligned. Well, at some point, I wanted to add some bling on this card front. I did bring out some of my sequences, but then later decided to leave it as is. And that's a look at our finished card. I love how this card turned out. You can still see some of those missing lines there, but well, I don't think I'm very much bothered with that since I love how beautiful the colors on this card front is and how beautifully those sentiment strips covered most of those imperfections. I hope you guys enjoyed watching the video and got inspired and found it helpful, especially when you want to cover up any of your mistakes or imperfections instead of redoing the entire thing all over again. All the supplies that I used in today's video will be linked down in the description box below. Note that all of these links are affiliate links, which means that if you shop using one of my links, I get a small commission at no cost to you guys. Thank you again for joining me today. Until next time, stay safe.